at the bottom will go away. Okay, let me turn that off. Okay, well, just first of all, may I just reiterate my thanks really to Raif Asmagur and the Muslim Research Network more broadly for this kind invitation to discuss this topic, which come really from these books, or the same book, of which there were a couple of editions, a first edition and a second edition. And even though it was published in 2010, the work for this topic, Muslim consciousness, double consciousness, began in Bristol in 2003. And I say that because I guess there was something of a novelty then in terms of thinking about the constellation of Muslim identity politics, which was still maybe finding its feet, still forming, and which I came to name Muslim consciousness, or the rise of Muslim consciousness, in the subtitle of the book. And the core issue that I guess the book was trying to chart was that relationship between Western, quote unquote, and in my case, British Muslim identities and the prevailing citizenship regime, how they evolved. And I was arguing that they kind of evolved together in good ways and in bad ways. And I think that remains as topical as ever and has probably become much more salient than I could have anticipated when I submitted the manuscripts for these books. In a way that makes me think that, you know, during the intercoursing years, the kind of flow and the intensity of the river has varied. It's been fast and ferocious at times. It's been more sedate at others. But the underlying kind of course and the current has endured, really. But of course, you know, the work that I was doing here was not standing alone. It was building upon a long-standing scholarship, to some extent a kind of a post-colonial scholarship, which critiqued what we think of as Orientalist thought on Islam and Muslims, and been documented by lots of excellent post-colonial scholars who I've kind of brought together in various collections and learned from over the years, especially those scholars who wanted to tell a story about the ways in which Islam, quote unquote, and Muslim societies, quote unquote, have been presented either as the past or Europe as the future of them waiting to catch up, or either or both of those things, but especially how, you know, Islam deviates from the norm of Christianity. And that was something which was previously established in the work of people like Bernard Lewis and all of those who wanted to advocate a kind of a deficit model, we might say, in terms of thinking about the relationship between Islam and what Europeans were understanding as modernity, I suppose. And very much, you know, crudely put in the title of that book, What Went Wrong. But the critique that I wanted, I think, to make, and I think had relevance beyond a critique of the Orientalist scholarship of the Muslim world, quote unquote, was actually about how that carried over, you know, that carried over into how people were advancing a social science account of religion, and wanted to say in that social science account that if we take as an aggregate public claims making, across Europe, what you'll see is that Muslims are more difficult to accommodate or integrate. In contrast, these authors argued, to other religions, because Islam is more publicly confessional, they argued, it's harder to privatize and instead advances into the public realm in collective and exceptional ways. And there were different authors who were kind of advocating this. Christian Yopko was one, Ruud Koopmans, and colleagues were others. And they all share in common a kind of a local version of that Bernard Lewis thesis of what went wrong as it related to questions of integration in European societies. You know, and they did so with this kind of remarkable disregard for actually talking to Muslims and trying to understand the spaces in which Muslims were negotiating a variety of standpoints, identities, political forces, and imagining and reimagining forms of their own identity. And so then missed everything that was happening, really, just because they had what was something of an ideological take on modernity and secularism as fashioned by European thinkers being the normal model, and everything which isn't consistent with that being deviant. In that respect, the problem that was being voiced without being articulated was the ways in which Islam was said to have this kind of relationship to modernity that was really about a kind of a European Christianity presenting itself as a secularism, even if it didn't have what was sacred in terms of what was important to Christianity. It had all the cultural reference points of Christianity. And it was in that context that I wanted to understand Muslim consciousness as a sociological development that plugs into a series of political debates. Some of those political debates kind of go well beyond the broadening of citizenship that I was initially interested in, but they're consistent with the trajectory of claims making I chart in chapter 4 of the book, insofar as the category of Muslim came to sit at this intersection of a cluster of different existential concerns. And it was a phrase that Anne Norton used, which I find helpful, and it came after my book, but I sometimes quote it, but because it captures something of that sentiment. She talks about, in our time, the figure of the Muslim has become the axis where questions of political philosophy and political ideology and politics and ethics meet in relation to Muslims.
Okay, all fine. Here.
You're all fine. Okay.
Thank
well, I was just saying, in relation to Anne Norton, precisely that axis that I was interested in, and in the way in which I suppose she was saying that in relation to Muslims, Islam, liberty, equality, and fraternity became not imperative, but they became questions, right? But it was always also clear to me that Muslim consciousness was not remotely the sum of those framings, that flattened out the meaning that Muslims attribute to their agency and their action and their communal life. And in fact, the opposite, Muslims often resisted being being presented solely as, the object of these people, and specifically by trying to promote their own forms of pluralism. And that's really kind of one of the key things that the book was interested in the way in which C. Wright Mills talked about, personal issues and personal troubles and public issues, in that Muslims and second and third generation Muslims in Europe were seeing their kind of identity and their claims making within the terms of public issues, and not just as something that were private matters. Because on the one hand, Muslims are being told to behave in a certain way, so it's already a public matter. So then to complain that Muslims are being public about their identity claims making is contradictory. And when we speak to Muslims, and when we did the field work and we looked at different kinds of forms of engagement, that was all apparent for anybody who would take an interest in that. But a lot of the commentators weren't. And so, that's kind of, I suppose, some of the political context in which I was trying to do this work and make sense of the ways in which Muslim identities were emerging during this time. But the Muslim consciousness concept began very much to help me connect a lot of these things, especially by drawing upon the work of the African-American thinker and writer W.E.B. Du Bois, William Edward Burghardt Bois, who I could talk about forever, but I won't. It's just merely to say that it wasn't easy to bring the work of this thinker to bear on the things I was studying. He was writing in a different time, in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, though he lived and wrote during the period of the Second World War and thereafter. But obviously, the context was very different. But what he was so good at doing who was so helpful in helping me to understand was that there was the emergence, I suppose, the kind of the fruition of a form of consciousness which is never finished, never complete, but it is almost a dialectic which moves between the self and the social and society. And that dialectic of consciousness about the ways in which minorities internalize kind of majority contempt, but they also have an additional second sight which comes with that. They can see the difference between, you know, the ideals of majority society and how majority society conduct themselves. At the same time, minorities retain this ambition for plurality, for doing things differently in a way in which is consistent with their cultural repertoires, with their histories, with their customs. And that sense in which there was this kind of duality, this double, I found really helpful, and specifically in trying to get a handle on the ways in which a kind of a diminished or an impaired citizenship gives rise to a kind of a particular sense of self, and or the kind of public claims making that comes from not just an impaired citizenship, actually a different set of ideas of the public, you know, how public space should be organized, what we should value, where the priorities should be for what we think of as a public good. And so I use that a lot, this kind of dialectic of consciousness between the self and society, to try to understand, well, this Muslim consciousness is not just a victim consciousness. It's not just a reactive consciousness. It's not just a we're being picked on. It's actually saying, well, look, we want to publicly express our faith, but we also want to pluralize a shared identity. And those things come together, and they can come together through an unfolding idea of what it was that citizenship meant. And that's an idea I think that, you know, subsequently became more accepted in the commentaries and the work of others. But one of the things which I think hasn't been settled, or is kind of ongoing, I suppose, and this is just, you know, the final point I'll end on here, is that I was never very keen on having a definitive definition of Muslim identity in a way in which became, you know, normative and insisted that, well, this is the criteria according to which people have to be Muslim. Because part of my argument was, I guess, that these things are conversations that Muslims have with Muslims, and they work it out in an ongoing conversation that isn't finished. And I say that because, you know, it strikes me that people can adopt the appellation, the term Muslim, without any unanimity on Islamic matters, right? Precisely as Jewish minorities have historically disagreed massively about what Jewish means, you know, in the context of Israel too, you know, massive disagreements in the Jewish diaspora about whether or not Israel and Jewish go together. But I think Muslims, we've struggled with that in terms of trying to make sense of, yes, faith and subscription to religious orthodoxy is a key place, key role, but our identities, anybody's identities, have multiple social layers. So how they interact with that, how those social identities interact with the scriptural text, isn't a settled or complete process. It kind of unfolds through conversation, and as different forms of Muslim consciousness, I suppose, become more salient, and the ways in which they're expressed in the public. So yeah, so just to kind of summarize, I suppose, what I thought were some of the key features of the book as I was trying to convey at the time, but I'll be very open to comment and discussion and response in terms of whether or not that's consistent with how the book and the work in it was being read by others. Thank you.
Thank you so much.